On July 3, 1976, the heat over the Ruhr Valley hung thick and chemical. In the industrial town of Duisburg, police followed a complaint from tenants at Friesenstrasse 11. Their drains were clogged, and water from the kitchen sink smelled of rot. When the plumber arrived, he unscrewed a section of pipe and recoiled. A human finger slipped into the basin. Within an hour, the police were at the door of Joachim Kroll, a quiet, stooped man who lived alone in a small, stale-smelling flat. The officers found him seated at the table, calm and polite. A pot of boiling stew hissed on the stove. When they lifted the lid, they saw pieces of meat and carrots. Kroll explained without hesitation, "Oh, that's from the girl. I was saving some for later." In his refrigerator lay more flesh, neatly wrapped, and in the bathroom, a small torso, partially dismembered. The victim was later identified as Marion Ketter, age 4, missing since the previous evening. A search of the nearby field confirmed her murder. Kroll offered no resistance during the arrest. Neighbors described him as harmless, simple-minded, quiet. He worked as a factory laborer at Mannesmann AG, kept to himself, and often fed stray cats. His landlord said he never caused trouble, only that strange smell. At the station, investigators from Duisburg Kripo were unprepared for what followed. Kroll began to talk, not in fear or confusion, but as if discussing chores. He admitted to killing Marion Ketter, then paused, thought, and began listing others. Ursula Roll, 1955, Manuela Knott, 1959, Petra Giese, 1962, and more. The list grew to 14 names. Detective Heinz Kanschat, present at the first interrogation, later recalled, "He remembered each scene, the time of day, the weather, the color of the child's dress, but never the faces." Within days, the police realized the man they had arrested was responsible for a string of unsolved murders stretching over 2 decades across the Ruhr region. He spoke of his killings as relief and of eating human flesh as saving money on meat. The press called him der RUHR CANNIBAL, the Ruhr cannibal. Behind the calm face of a simple laborer, investigators had found a man who had evaded capture for 20 years, leaving bodies across Duisburg, Essen, Bottrop, and Mülheim. The flat on Friesenstrasse became the last page of that history and the first page of his confession. The next morning, headlines spread through the Ruhr Valley, "Cannibal caught in Duisburg." But the locals didn't believe it at first. He'd lived among them for decades, the quiet man who fed the cats, who worked shifts at the factory, who said little and always nodded politely. No one ever thought to look inside his fridge. Joachim Georg Kroll was born on April 17, 1933, in Hindenburg, Upper Silesia, the youngest of 8 children in a poor coal miner's family. His father, Friedrich Kroll, was drafted into the German army during the Second World War and never returned from the Eastern Front. When the war ended, Joachim was 12. His mother, August, led the surviving children west, joining thousands of refugees fleeing the ruins of Silesia. They arrived in North Rhine-Westphalia, settling near Dinslaken, where hunger and displacement shaped the years that followed. Neighbors later described young Kroll as quiet, slow, obedient. He spoke little, avoided games, and was known to wet the bed long past childhood. Teachers noted he struggled with reading and memory. Intelligence tests would later record an IQ of 76, borderline intellectual disability. His classmates mocked him. He responded by withdrawing completely. The sense of humiliation became permanent. Psychologists from Duisburg University, reviewing his early years after his arrest, concluded that war trauma, isolation, and intellectual delay had formed a personality incapable of empathy, yet desperate for control. As a boy, Kroll spent long hours near the fields outside town, dissecting animals. He explained this later to police. When the rabbits were still, they didn't leave me. His mother tolerated his behavior, seeing him as simple but harmless. She kept him close, and until his late 20s, he lived with her in cramped post-war apartments. After finishing a basic trade school, he worked briefly as a farmhand, then as a factory cleaner. Colleagues remembered him as clumsy but diligent, the man who never spoke unless spoken to. Post-war Germany of the 1950s offered anonymity to people like Kroll. Cities rebuilt. The mines and steelworks demanded labor, not conversation. In that grey industrial world, he passed unnoticed, a man shaped by absence. When questioned decades later about his youth, he said simply, "There was no joy, only work and quiet." Forensic psychiatrists believe his first violent fantasies began in those years, during moments of isolation and sexual confusion. Kroll admitted to his first act of violence in 1955, when a young girl disappeared near Waldstede. He was 22. That year would mark the silent beginning of what investigators later called the long shadow across the Ruhr. The year was 1955. West Germany was rebuilding. Factories rose from bombed foundations, and the Ruhr Valley was thick with smoke and secrecy. Joachim Kroll, then 22, worked as a farmhand near the village of Waldstede, close to Hamm. To his employer, he was slow but obedient, a laborer who never drank and rarely spoke. On the evening of February 8th, a 19-year-old girl named Irmgard Strel was found dead by a riverbank. She had been strangled. The police linked no suspect to the crime. It was one of many unsolved cases of the post-war decade. Years later, during his interrogation, Kroll admitted quietly, "That was the first time I knew how to stop the thoughts." He described the moment as if he had been watching someone else. No anger, no plan, just an impulse he called the urge. Investigators later learned that Kroll returned to the scene several times after the murder, studying the area, learning how to remain invisible. Through the late 1950s and early 1960s, similar killings appeared throughout the Ruhr region. Girls and young women strangled in fields or woods, sometimes mutilated. Police believed they were isolated cases committed by different offenders. There was no centralized database to connect them. Kroll moved frequently: Dinslaken, Bottrop, Essen, Duisburg. He worked in factories, lived in cheap rooms, and blended into the grey mass of industrial laborers. He adopted routine as camouflage: work by day, walk by night. Neighbors later told police he was quiet, kind to cats, and afraid of women. By 1959, his fantasies had grown into ritual. He kept a small knife and a cloth bag hidden beneath his bed. He spoke of them later as "my tools for peace." That summer, he killed Clara Tills, a 16-year-old from Essen. Her body was found 2 days later in a ditch. Again, no suspect. Again, Kroll returned home, ate dinner with his mother, and went to work the next morning. The pattern grew quietly. Between 1959 and 1962, 5 girls vanished around the Ruhr. Manuela Knott, Petra Giese, Monika Tafel, Jutta Rahn, and others. Each case carried the same signature: strangulation, post-mortem mutilation, and occasional removal of flesh. The police in Essen and Duisburg worked separately. Jurisdictions rarely shared files. The press called it the Ruhr Strangler series. Kroll read those articles at work and kept the clippings in his drawer. In his confession, he said, "I liked to see how they looked for me." They did not know it was so easy. Forensic psychiatrists would later conclude that Kroll's crimes were not driven by rage, but by curiosity and sexual incompetence. He lacked social contact, feared rejection, and turned his impulse inward, toward power over the motionless. Dr. Friedrich Stein, who examined him in 1982, wrote, "He was not sadistic in the classical sense. He was pathologically curious about stillness." In 1966, Kroll murdered a 5-year-old girl, Ursula Roll, in Wuppertal. Her disappearance led to one of the largest search operations in the region. Police questioned hundreds of workers, including Kroll. He was released after 15 minutes. "Too harmless," the detective noted. The following year brought his most brazen crime yet, the murder of Monika Taffel, aged 12, whose body was found near a railway embankment in Essen. The public panic forced police to arrest an innocent man, who later took his own life in custody. Kroll read about it and told investigators years later, "I thought then God had helped me." He moved again, each time escaping notice. He changed jobs: butcher's assistant, machine cleaner, night janitor, each position granting him privacy and access to tools. His mother died in 1960. After that, he lived alone. Neighbors saw him walking late at night through the RUHR's industrial edges, where steam rose from factory pipes and fog hid everything. By the early 1970s, Kroll's pattern was clear. To him, if not to the police. He selected victims from quiet streets, preferred children, and attacked in the open fields of the RUHR's outskirts. He described his impulse as a pressure in the chest. After each murder, the pressure faded for months. In 1970, he killed Maria Het, a 13-year-old from Mülheim. By then, he was working at the Mannesmann factory and living alone in a small apartment on Friesenstrasse. He owned no television, no radio, no friends. When psychiatrists later asked why he chose children, he answered, "They were easier to carry." The crimes continued, each more methodical, each more depersonalized. He spoke of cutting and keeping parts as rationing meat, a phrase that appears verbatim in the court transcripts. Cannibalism for him was not ritual, but utility. He cooked human flesh alongside pork to disguise the smell. Police would later count 14 murders across 21 years. Kroll remembered the dates with precision, but spoke of them as if they belonged to someone else. The pattern only ended in 1976, when a blocked pipe revealed what his mind had hidden for decades. Forensic experts called him the most ordinary face of evil Germany had produced since the war. His crimes spanned an era, from post-war poverty to modern reconstruction, and in every phase he remained invisible. When asked at trial why he never stopped, Kroll said only, "I thought they would not miss them." By 1969, Joachim Kroll had become a ghost of the Ruhr Valley. He changed addresses 6 times in 10 years, always choosing modest, narrow apartments near industrial zones, places where the smell of smoke and oil masked anything. At his new home in Duisburg-Lahr, on Friesenstrasse 11, he lived quietly with his canary and a small radio, working nights at the nearby Mannesmann steelworks as a cleaner. His co-workers knew him only as Uncle Joe. He smiled awkwardly, brought leftovers in paper bags and kept to himself. No one suspected that behind his drawn curtains he kept trophies, small pieces of flesh, women's watches, and buttons. Between 1969 and 1976, committed at least 6 murders, confirmed by court records. Each crime followed the same rhythm. He would wander, select, strike, and then dismember, often cooking small pieces afterward. The investigators later reconstructed his routes, narrow paths near Mülheim, Essen, and Duisburg, each chosen for isolation. He rarely strayed more than 20 kilometers from home. Psychiatrists who later reviewed the pattern noted his precision. He killed as if cleaning a machine, one report said. No emotion, only method. Kroll himself described the process as relief. He would strangle his victims quickly, then act with cold efficiency. When asked how he chose them, he replied, "They were there. I thought they were for me." In 1970, after killing Maria Het, he began saving small portions of flesh, boiling them in his kitchen. His neighbors sometimes complained of a sweet, unpleasant odor, which he explained as rabbit stew. No one questioned it. Post-war poverty had taught silence. When investigators opened his apartment 6 years later, they found portions of human meat wrapped in cellophane inside his refrigerator, carefully labeled. The autopsy teams later matched DNA traces from several victims. The pattern, they realized, had lasted over 2 decades without a single witness who ever truly saw him. In 1974, Kroll's behavior began to shift. He started collecting crime clippings and underlining phrases like manhunt and unknown suspect. His fascination with detection grew alongside his confidence. At night, he walked along the Rhine bridges, staring into the water. That year, a young woman named Ingrid Cruz disappeared while cycling home from a fair in Duisburg. Her body was discovered in a wooded area outside town, mutilated in a manner consistent with earlier crimes. Forensic pathologists identified identical knife patterns, short, parallel cuts on the torso. Yet again, the investigation led nowhere. Police sketches described a man of medium height, quiet face, unremarkable. The description matched 1,000 factory workers in the Ruhr. Detective Karl Weiss, who later became chief investigator on the case, said, "It was like hunting smoke. He had no car, no pattern of escape. He was the pattern." During this time, Kroll reportedly experimented with methods to preserve parts of his victims. Investigators found traces of salt and vinegar in his kitchen drawers, alongside tools meticulously cleaned and stored in folded newspaper. He noted times and dates in a small notebook, fragments of which survived, showing lines like "quiet day." The meat was soft. The journal was never fully deciphered, though forensic handwriting experts verified it as authentic. By 1975, local newspapers began linking several murders by geography. The press coined the term the RUHR cannibal, though police still lacked physical evidence. They interviewed more than 200 suspects. Kroll was questioned twice, once at his workplace, once at home. Both times he appeared calm and cooperative. He even made coffee, one officer recalled. July 1976 marked the final stage of his ritual. On the 3rd, a 4-year-old girl named Marion Ketter vanished from her neighborhood in Duisburg. Witnesses saw her near the courtyard where Kroll lived. Her disappearance triggered one of the largest searches in regional history. Hundreds of officers, dogs, and volunteers combed the streets through the night. 2 days later, residents complained of a blocked pipe in Kroll's building. The maintenance crew arrived, removed part of the drain, and found fragments of human tissue. Police were called immediately. When officers entered Kroll's apartment, the scene was deceptively ordinary. Curtains drawn, bed neatly made, a pan still warm on the stove. Inside it lay pieces of cooked meat and carrots. In the refrigerator, a severed hand and part of a leg wrapped in plastic. Kroll sat by the table, quietly smoking. When questioned, he confessed within minutes. "I saved her for later," he said. "The others are gone." The arrest report from July 3, 1976, signed by Detective Weiss, became infamous in German criminology. It was the first time the phrase RUHR cannibal appeared in an official document. In custody, Kroll guided investigators through 21 years of killings with unsettling calm. He remembered names, dates, and streets with precision. His only question was practical. "Will I get the meat again in prison?" That statement closed the final chapter of his ritual and opened a new one, the dissection of his mind by psychiatrists and courts that struggled to define the meaning of monstrosity within the bounds of law. When the officers entered Kroll's apartment on July 3, 1976, they expected a plumbing complaint, not a crime scene. What they found instead reshaped German criminal history. The drain, clogged with flesh, led them to the man quietly sitting in his kitchen. On the stove, a pot simmered, inside it pieces of meat and carrots. When asked what it was, Kroll replied, "It's dinner." The silence that followed would echo through courtrooms for years. Detective Karl Weiss, the first to interrogate him, later wrote in his memoir, "He answered everything like he was explaining a recipe." In the first 48 hours after arrest, Kroll gave a series of calm, detailed confessions. He described his killings with mechanical precision, naming victims police had not yet connected. His knowledge of the crime scenes was exact: distances, directions, even weather conditions on specific days. By the end of the week, investigators had reopened more than a dozen cold cases across North Rhine-Westphalia. The scale was staggering. Evidence collected from Kroll's apartment included kitchen utensils with traces of human tissue, frozen meat samples, and a notebook listing dates and initials. Each entry matched a known disappearance. Forensic analysis confirmed that the remains in his apartment belonged to Marion Ketter, his final victim. Blood and tissue residues also linked him to at least 4 other murders. The media response was immediate and ferocious. Der Spiegel published the now iconic cover titled Der Menschenfresser von Duisburg, the man-eater of Duisburg. Crowds gathered outside the police station. Some shouted for his execution, others stood in stunned silence, unable to comprehend the ordinariness of the man who had lived among them for decades. The investigation expanded through 1977 to 1978. Dozens of detectives and forensic experts from Essen, Düsseldorf, and Bonn collaborated to reconstruct the killings. Each murder was cross-referenced with missing person records and forensic findings. It became one of the most complex serial crime investigations in post-war Germany. Kroll's demeanor during interrogations remained chillingly consistent. He showed no remorse and often spoke about his actions as though they were maintenance tasks. When asked why he killed, he said, "I wanted to keep them with me." They were quiet then. Psychiatric evaluations were ordered by the Landgericht Duisburg. Dr. Rudolf Lipp and Dr. Friedrich Stein, leading forensic psychiatrists of the time, diagnosed Kroll with schizoid personality disorder and severe sexual deviation, but emphasized his understanding of wrongdoing. Stein's report concluded, "He is not insane. He is profoundly defective in empathy, yet aware of the law he breaks." This statement shaped the prosecution's case. Kroll was criminally responsible. The defense argued that his cognitive limitations and delusions made him incapable of full responsibility. He had an IQ of 76, poor education, and a childlike understanding of consequences. Yet his methodical concealment of evidence and his ability to plan killings contradicted the claim of insanity. The police also investigated false arrests tied to his earlier murders, including the wrongful imprisonment and death of a man accused in the Monika Tafel case. This revelation intensified public outrage and pressure on the justice system. By 1979, prosecutors had compiled 10 confirmed murders and 4 probable. The list read like a timeline of invisible horror, stretching from 1955 to 1976. The trial opened on October 4, 1982, in Duisburg District Court, under heavy security. The courtroom was small, sterile, and filled with journalists from across Europe. Kroll appeared calm, dressed in a cheap grey suit, hands folded, eyes downcast. He greeted the judges politely. Over 151 sessions, the court heard testimony from more than 100 witnesses, detectives, forensic specialists, and family members of the victims. The evidence was irrefutable. Tissue samples, fingerprints, and confessions matched across decades. Reporters described the atmosphere as suffocating. When the prosecutor, Horst Heymann, read the list of victims aloud, Kroll's face remained expressionless. Only once did he interrupt, correcting a date. Dr. Stein, testifying again, reiterated that Kroll was an emotionless mechanism of habit. The jury listened in silence. At no point did he deny any killing. His only question to the judge was logistical. When will I go back to my cell? I don't like so many people. On April 8, 1982, Joachim Kroll was found guilty on 8 counts of murder and 1 of attempted murder. He received 9 consecutive life sentences, the harshest penalty under West German law. He was transferred to Rheinbach prison, where he lived quietly, spending his days cleaning corridors and reading simple picture magazines. In 1991, after 15 years in custody, he died of a heart attack at age 61. His death certificate listed occupation, laborer. In prison, Joachim Kroll lived like a shadow. After his conviction in 1982, he was transferred to Rheinbach Correctional Facility, a quiet institution in North Rhine-Westphalia. There, surrounded by concrete and silence, he resumed the same life he had always known: repetition, routine, and invisibility. Guards described him as polite, almost gentle. He cleaned hallways, folded uniforms, and avoided eye contact. He never spoke of his crimes unless asked directly. When newcomers learned who he was, they often refused to share a cell block. He frightened no one by gesture, one guard later said, only by thought. Medical staff reported that Kroll's health declined steadily through the 1980s. He suffered from chronic heart disease and partial paralysis of his right arm. Yet his behavior remained orderly. He requested children's magazines, simple puzzles, and occasionally cookbooks, though these were later restricted. Psychiatrists from the University of Cologne visited him annually for follow-up assessments. Their reports described a man without evolution, no remorse, no moral insight, only the persistence of habit. He speaks of the past as one might speak of broken tools, one noted in 1987. No relatives ever visited. He received a small pension from his last employer, which he used to buy extra food from the prison commissary, mainly canned meat and bread. In July 1991, guards found him unconscious in his cell. He was taken to the prison hospital, where he died hours later of a heart attack, age 61. There was no funeral. His body was cremated quietly. News of his death appeared briefly in German papers beneath the headlines of politics and sports. Der Spiegel published a short note titled Der Mann, der niemandem auffiel, the man no one noticed. By then, the case of the RUHR cannibal had already entered criminology textbooks. Kroll's murders became a key study in behavioral pattern analysis, an example of serial normalization, where a killer hides not through brilliance, but through banality. Dr. Friedrich Stein, who had testified in his trial, reflected years later, he was the absence of intent made flesh, evil stripped of drama. Forensic historians drew parallels between Kroll and the post-war environment that shaped him, a generation numbed by deprivation, silence, and disconnection. His crimes, they argued, reflected a society that had learned to look away. In 2001, portions of his psychiatric files were declassified for academic study. They revealed a man who understood little of morality, yet fully grasped consequence. In his final recorded interview from 1989, Kroll was asked if he regretted anything. He paused, thought for several seconds, and answered, "No. I just got caught." That sentence, simple and unembellished, became the last line of Germany's longest-running serial murder case, a coda of emptiness after 21 years of horror.